Welcome to Author Life Podcast, where myself and guest authors share their stories, offer tips and advice, and share our writing, publishing, and marketing knowledge. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden. Welcome back to the Write, Publish, Repeat podcast. It's been a little while since I released an episode, and I apologize for that. Things got a little busy over the holidays, and I didn't get any recording done. But we are back today, continuing with our discussion on creating good characters. And today, more specifically, we'll be talking about developing a backstory that matters. And when it comes to backstory, really kind of goes back to that saying, the devil is in the details. Figuring out your details and working them in appropriately is how you can develop a really great backstory. So we're going to be discussing that today on the podcast. So let's first talk about the reason behind having a backstory. Backstory comes into play with your character because it tells the reader who your character is now at the beginning of the story. How did they get there? Why is your character the way they are? Why does your character do, say, think, act in a certain way? Your backstory is going to help give them that information of what your character's life has been like previous to page 1 of the book. And backstory is also important when it comes to the overall story. Your backstory provides your character with motivations for future actions and an avenue for development. It also can be a vehicle for your character arc. Another way to keep the pacing more slow and steady is to alternate reveals. So you can move away from saying too much about one character by revealing more about one of the other characters instead. Now, another thing to consider about backstory and how much to reveal and when to reveal and at what pacing to reveal is to consider the fact that as you're building your character's previous existence, you're coming up with a lot of details. You know who their third grade teacher is, where they went to school in middle school, all of these details about them that has helped you shape that character and turn them into who they are. But a lot of that is never going to come into play in the book. And kind of a number that I've seen several authors refer to is kind of a 60-40 split. About 40% of what you come up with will be relevant backstory information, and 60% of that backstory is only going to be known by you. And a really interesting example of that is J.K. Rowling's and Dumbledore. In the series itself, you do learn a lot about Dumbledore and some aspects of his life before becoming head of Hogwarts, but there was a lot more that J.K. Rowling's had developed and never used in the story. And that really became apparent when at one point a reporter or a reader, I can't remember which one, asked her if Dumbledore had ever had any love interests. And her response was, oh, well, of course, the character you meet toward the end of the series where he's a young man, so that's who he was in love with. Dumbledore was gay. And nobody else knew that but her because it never came up in the story. It was never a relevant part of his backstory as far as the Harry Potter storyline went. But that was something she had developed as part of her backstory development, and she knew, but up to that point of someone asking her about it, it had never been a topic that needed to be discussed. So you may find similar things developing your backstory, things that you came up with and helped you to create that character, but never played an important part in the actual writing of the book. And that is totally fine. You only want to put in what is relevant and what really needs to be there in order for the readers to stay engaged. Now, let's talk about realism in developing a backstory. Consider meeting a person for the first time. What do you learn about that person in the first 5 minutes of meeting them? What about in the first 5 days, 5 months, 5 years? Each of those gaps of time, you're going to learn different things about that person. You're not going to learn every detail of their life within 5 minutes of meeting them. That would be highly unusual. And as you're considering about when you learn things, think of it in the aspect of situations. So what would bring up talking about religion with someone? What about politics? Why would you get onto the topic of past boyfriends? What's going to lead to that conversation? Or talking about family and childhood experiences or issues. What kinds of situations or topics or conversations lead to people to discuss those things? And sometimes it can come up in casual conversation, but things that are more difficult are going to take more prompting, and they're going to take a closer relationship before a person's willing to discuss some of those things. Also consider what type of situations inspire conversations about difficult things in a person's past. Those are not topics that come up, definitely not within the first 5 minutes of meeting someone usually. It's going to take building that trust between two people before that's going to be discussed. Also consider what information are people usually willing and unwilling to reveal about themselves. It may be perfectly natural for someone to mention that they're married and have 3 children when you first meet them, but they may not want to discuss the fact that perhaps this is their 4th marriage and 2 of their children do not live with them because they lost custody. Those are going to be a little bit more difficult to just bring up casually. So consider the difference between topics that are willingly discussed and topics that take a little bit more to draw out. And basically, as you're considering these things in real relationships that you've experienced, you want to apply that toward your characters. You want to reveal information in the same fashion and because of similar reasons and situations. That's how it's going to feel more real to your reader. Now, how do you carefully weave backstory into your story without letting it overpower everything else or bore your readers to tears? That is a question that you'll probably ask every time you start a new story, and it's an important one. So let's talk about some specific tactics. One of the things you really need to consider is relevance. And I talked about that a little bit when I gave the example of J.K. Rowling's and Dumbledore, but let's discuss it a little bit more here. When you're considering whether or not a piece of information needs to be included in the story as part of the backstory, ask yourself, is this information relevant to the current situation? For example, a person who was stuck on a Ferris wheel overnight can definitely pertain to a fear of carnivals in the present. That would probably be a difficult situation to be in. However, having once gotten sick from drinking bad milk, that's not really going to be pertinent to their fear of carnivals. That may be something that is brought up at another point, but when you're having a specific discussion about your character, don't add in details that have nothing to do with anything. Also, another question to consider when we're talking about relevance is, does this information show how they are changing from who they used to be? A character fearfully standing in front of a crowd relates to backstory information of public ridicule as a child that they're attempting to overcome. Drinking coffee out of a blue cup instead of a white one really doesn't have any bearing on fear of public speaking. That may just be an interesting little quirk that you bring up at some point, but it's not relevant to that exact situation and would be better brought up elsewhere in the story. Now, dialogue can be really important in using backstory effectively. When you're using dialogue to reveal certain parts of the backstory, try not to just give bare facts in dialogue. You want to present the information in the form of argument, confrontation, gossip, investigation, things of that nature, where instead of just giving information to the reader, you're also giving them context and making it more interesting. Also consider with dialogue, is someone else listening in while this information is being shared? Could they be overheard or recorded? Should anyone else know about what they've discovered? That's going to change the tempo and the tenor of the conversation, depending on, whether it's secretive or not. Also, you can reveal backstory while building suspense, intrigue, and conflict through dialogue, and that can be a really effective way to do that. Allow your character personality and dynamic to add flavor to the bare facts that are being revealed, and that will make your dialogue much more effective. A great example of using dialogue effectively to reveal backstory comes from Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. So as I read this short excerpt, listen to not only what information is being presented, but how it's being presented. So here's the excerpt from A Streetcar Named Desire. Listen, baby, when we first met, you and me, you thought I was common. Well, how right you was. I was common as dirt. You showed me a snapshot of the place with them columns, and I pulled you down off them columns, and you loved it, having them colored lights going. And wasn't we happy together? Wasn't it all okay? Till she showed up here, hoity-toity, describing me like an ape. So in that short excerpt, you get a lot of information about the two main characters, how they view each other, what they used to be like, and how that has changed with the arrival of this new person. It gives a lot of information, but it does it in context through the character's voice, which makes it more interesting and more engaging. Narration is another way to reveal backstory that can work really well. A way to do that is through having the character reveal their own backstory. And you can do that through observations of situations or observations of the world seen through their worldview and their past experiences. This allows them to comment based on how they see things due to their past and the way that they perceive things. You can also use their emotional responses to what they're currently experiencing and how past experiences have caused these specific responses. Another way to use narration is through commentary, and that may be social commentary or other forms of commentary, but this gives glimpses into how the character feels about aspects of society, other people, and the world, and it gives the reader more understanding of why they see things this way. Now, a good example of that is from Thornton Wilder's Our Town, and this is just a very short excerpt from that. This is the way we were in our growing up, and in our marrying, and in our doctoring, and in our living, and in our dying. So that's just a very short glimpse there from Our Town, but it does give you this sense of how the character looks at the world and the people around him, and how he perceives his own existence within it. Now, the next way of using backstory effectively is through internal dialogue. We talk to ourselves all the time, so should your characters. Go ahead and just let them have those internal thoughts and dialogue. Let them talk to themselves. There are so many things we don't say out loud every day. Instead, we say them to ourselves in our heads. If we did say everything out loud that we were thinking, there would not only be consequences to that, most likely, others would know our true opinions and feelings on certain matters, and most of us would not be comfortable with that. Readers want to know a character's psychology, so let them get inside your character's heads. It will provide them details that allow the reader to more fully connect and understand their choices, as well as their motives and actions, even if they disagree or are at odds with them. And that's a really important part of fiction, because you want to be able to have a wide variety of readers relate to your character, not just the readers who have similar opinions and beliefs as your character. Now, a good example of using internal dialogue to communicate backstory comes from Judith Guest's Ordinary People. Jarrett, you got to be kidding me. I don't get it. I excuse you from practice twice a week so you can see some shrink. What the hell more am I supposed to be doing for you? Nothing. Shrink. I hate that word. Coarse, ignorant, just like the kind of word you would expect from a stupid bastard like Salon, and not get mad control is all just someday come down here, tell him what he can do with his goddamn ignorant opinions. So you get a short piece of dialogue between these two characters, and then you get his response, Jarrett's response to what his coach has said. And that is the much more honest response. What he says out loud is nothing. There's nothing his coach can do for him. In his head, he goes off on this rant about how ignorant he thinks this man is and how frustrated he is. So with internal dialogue, you often get much more of an honest reaction from your character that the readers otherwise aren't going to be able to see. Now, we discussed flashbacks a little bit early as a starting point for introducing backstory, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. If you are going to use them, there are ways to do it effectively and appropriately. So again, use flashbacks very sparingly. They do tend to slow the story and detract from the current scene, so you don't want to just sprinkle them in all over the place. The benefit of using a flashback is that they provide direct information about a past event that is integral to the story. So there better be a point behind putting it in, and no better way to give readers the information. Flashbacks should enhance the present story and divulge secrets or important information. So again, make sure there is a good reason for using a flashback. Now, a really great example of a flashback comes from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. On the last afternoon before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long time, silent time. It was a cold fall day, with fire in the room and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly one with another, than when she brushed silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers, gently, as though she were asleep. So this is a very short flashback put in to The Great Gatsby, and the reason behind putting that in there is that when Daisy shows up again and Gatsby kind of throws his life into chaos a little bit and really kind of does things that seem out of character for him, this gives you that deeper reasoning behind it. He's not just being brash, he's not doing something on a whim. This is a woman that he felt a very deep connection with and then lost over time after he left. And when he has this chance to try and reconnect with her, because of this scene, you understand that deeper connection and his reason for doing something that ultimately does not end well for him. Now, another route to go with revealing backstory is through secondary sources. And these can be things like diaries, journals, newspapers, books and letters, things like that. This could be directly from the character's point of view. For example, if they were reading their own journals from an earlier time in life, you can relate those experiences that way. Or it could be another person's point of view giving insight into an event in the character's life. For example, a newspaper report on a death or accident. It gives you all the information, but it's from an outside source. A good way to reveal details or truth about a person or situation that the character doesn't know can be through these secondary sources, because they provide what can be a change in the character or the storyline to move it forward while still revealing information about the backstory. And the last tactic for revealing backstory is to sometimes just go ahead and tell your reader part of the backstory. You always hear show, don't tell. There are always exceptions to every rule, and sometimes you really do just have to tell the reader some of the details you need them to know. This can be done by any of the modes already mentioned, but it's going to be more direct and less dramatized. So you want to use the tell tactic when the information needs to be explained quickly and succinctly, and it doesn't need a high emotional content to draw the readers in and make the experience relatable. So this is when you just need to get some bare facts down on the table so the reader understands what's going on. This is best used for details or events that are not integral to the character arc, but important in explaining how they ended up where they are in the current storyline. Now, one more tip about revealing backstory is that backstory should not be revealed nonsensically. There needs to be a reason that it's brought up. Like I mentioned earlier, people don't just start talking about past experiences, especially unpleasant ones. They're not going to just openly reveal everything about their entire life to you. There needs to be a trigger. Every time backstory discussion comes up or is initiated, it should be because something required it or pushed that character to discuss something. Usually that's done through conflict, confrontation, perhaps a sensory experience that brings back a memory, being in a position of facing their fears, things like that. So don't just have your character start blabbing on and on about their life experiences. Give them a reason and then only discuss the portion of the backstory that pertains to that trigger. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about before we wrap up the podcast for today is how to deal with touchy subjects in relation to backstory. There are always certain aspects that, have the potential to push readers away if they're not done well. And so we're going to talk about a few of those. The first one I want to address is culture. There are a few questions you should ask yourself when considering writing about a particular culture. Does it pertain to the story and or the character art? How will it affect the character's beliefs, actions, and decisions? And probably most importantly, can you portray it accurately? If you're not familiar with a particular culture, remember that someone else is living in that culture. They know it inside and out. And if you cannot accurately portray that, they're going to pick up on that very quickly and be turned off from the story. Also, bringing in a specific culture does require a certain amount of finesse. So you really need to know your stuff, either through personal experience or through detailed research. Don't, just try to wing it. It's not going to work very well. Another difficult subject to deal with is religion. You want to ask kind of those same questions you asked for the culture with the addition to a few more. So do consider how much you want religion to factor into the overall story. Anything that seems too religious will get shelved in the religious section, basically to kind of warn people that you're going to be discussing religious topics. And that may not be where you want your book to be shelved, or you may be totally fine with that. So it's just something to consider about where your book's going to end up, either on physical shelves or in categories on online stores, because that's going to attract different sets of readers depending on where that gets labeled. Also consider religious culture. Devout religiosity transcends all other factors to build a culture in and of itself. Can you accurately work that into every facet of your character's life? And also, are you comfortable having your character make decisions based on religious overtones? And that may work really well with your story, or it may not. So do consider how much of an impact you want a religious theme to play on the story. And that's going to help you decide whether to make it kind of just something very much in the background or something that's going to be a major part in the forefront of the story. And again, do your research or use experience. Make sure you're getting the details of whatever religion you're portraying. You want to get those details right. So another touchy subject is politics. Political discussion can instantly turn a reader off for several reasons. One might be that they have opposing views from you, and the other might be that they think you as the author are trying to indoctrinate them. Both of those are very quick triggers for a lot of readers, and they will not continue reading. So you have to be really careful in avoiding those two, and you need to rely heavily on a well-developed backstory, so views that aren't shared by your reader are still understandable to them in some way, and that will allow them to connect with the character even if they disagree and continue through the story. So do ask yourself, are you trying to prove a point or tell a story? If you are writing in the range of political nonfiction, that is a very different thing. If you are writing fiction, you have to handle politics a little bit more delicately because most readers who are picking up a novel are intending to connect with their characters, not to debate politics. So it's a fine line. Be careful there. And the next one is talking about sexuality. And there's two different aspects to this that you really need to consider as you're writing. The first one is sexual intimacy. Where do your character's beliefs about sexual intimacy come from? And this applies whether you're talking about abstinence or kind of a more open view of sexuality. It really applies to either one. Where did they get that viewpoint from? Also, if you are going the route of abstinence, does their reason for waiting have enough substance? This is something that readers will be very critical of. If you don't give your character a good enough reason for waiting until marriage, you will most likely get some criticism for that. It's not necessarily that they disagree with the choice, but they want a good reason for it. And that can be difficult to provide sometimes. Another question is, do their personal views drive readers away or engender understanding? So whatever viewpoint your character takes, you really need to work on making that integral to themselves as the character rather than your own opinion being pushed on them, because readers will pick up on that. So the other side of the sexuality issue is sexual orientation. When you're considering what orientation to use for your character, you really do need to consider, is it absolutely pertinent to the story to go one way or the other? Really, really try to avoid having token characters. And that's basically like, well, in order for this to seem current and modern, I need to have a gay person in my story. If you really feel that that is necessary, then by all means, do that. If you're only throwing it in because you worry you might not seem diverse enough if you don't, that's not a good reason. And again, readers will pick up on that and they'll kind of be turned off. And also don't choose sexual orientation just hoping for some shock value. That's not going to be very effective, and it's not going to create a character with a lot of depth most of the time. The other aspect of that to consider is, can you accurately describe the emotional and physical aspects of a particular orientation? And that doesn't necessarily mean you're having to describe actual physical intimacy, but you do need to be aware and be comfortable discussing topics that would come up with either orientation. So, really look at your own comfort level, your own knowledge of either of these aspects, and then make the decision from there rather than just kind of throwing in one or the other. Now, the last one to consider as far as touchy subjects go is race and ethnicity. And some questions to consider again are, whatever race or ethnicity you choose to work with, is it essential to the story? Can you get the details right? And will other readers be able to relate to what you're writing? Diversity is really kind of a hot topic right now in writing and publishing, but publishers and agents are wary of writers who write outside of their own race and ethnicity, because the concern is that it's difficult to do that authentically. Readers don't seem to have as much of a concern about that, but for agents and publishers who are, investing money, they're less likely to take that risk. So that is something to consider as well. So if you don't have a reason for making this an issue in your writing, just don't make it an issue. Specific race or ethnicity must have an impact on the main storyline, as well as how the characters think, act, and believe, and how it affects their worldview. So do consider all of those aspects before you choose a particular race or ethnicity for your character. If there's not a good reason for it, you're kind of just creating more work for yourself than what there needs to be. Now, we've talked about a lot of different areas of backstory, so let's try to put it all together as we wrap up the podcast for today. Convincing readers to care about your character is akin to introducing them to a new friend. So let that friendship develop naturally. Put yourself in your character's shoes and consider what information you would want others to know about you and how it would come up in natural situations. Allow the reader to be clever. They want to discover the truth about your character on their own. It's much more rewarding for them to be able to discover some of these things as they read. So try not to ruin the surprise for them by giving them too much all at once or holding it off until the very end when they've kind of figured things out on their own. It does take some thought and preparation on bringing that backstory out throughout the story in a way that it lets your readers connect with your character and discover the intricacies of that character for themselves. So as a kind of a parting thought today, just remember that as ogres are like onions, your characters are also. Reveal their backstory to your readers one layer at a time, and that will help you build a deep and lasting friendship between your reader and your character, and that will inspire them to keep coming back for more and to keep investing their time in your characters' lives and stories. So hopefully these tips were helpful in allowing you to create a deeper, more complex, more rewarding backstory. I'll be back again soon with another aspect of character building. But for today, I'm going to go ahead and sign off from the podcast and get back to getting some writing done. So I will see you all next time, and please always feel free to leave comments or suggest topics that you would like to hear covered on the podcast. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again for listening to Author Life Podcast. For more information on the podcast or guest authors, check out the links in the show description. If there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, find me online and send me suggestions anytime.